identify and find common ground. Hello, everybody. Now, we are in step 6 of Operation Magician, and in this one, I'm going to be talking about something that we've already kind of seen back, I think, in step 2. When we establish rapport, we need to find that common ground. But in this video, I'm going to be mixing more ideas than I usually do to kind of drive this home and equip you and I with the tools we need in order to effectively identify and find that common ground with the person so then we can start to make transformations. Now, the very first tip comes from Chris Voss, and Chris Voss basically states that you should either paraphrase or summarize what the person is saying or even what they're displaying. Right now, the displaying part, I'm adding that in, but that's like if you see that the person is angry, sad, happy, like paraphrase that, summarize that, right? To kind of initiate that type of feedback loop from the other person, right? Like, you look like you're sad. No, I'm actually upset, or, so you'll get that feedback loop. Now, this is very important when you're trying to establish that rapport, that common ground with the other person, because identity ultimately comes from a collective group. Now, in a minute, we're going to get deeper into identity with Erikson's theory. But what we need to understand is that many times we don't see an individual in a collective group. When we see an individual in a collective group, it's easier to detect that person's cultural influence, right? But many times, especially in cities or big cities, you have people from different, sometimes even different parts of the country or different parts of the world with different cultures, with different mindsets, right? So they are there as individuals, as lone wolves, obviously with the past collective group baggage and all of their cultural norms and prejudices installed already in them. But they are operating under new terrain, right? And that's where sometimes people will say, well, I'm having an identity crisis, right? I'm confused about who I am. I used to live in country A, now I live in country B. Am I going to continue acting like I was in country A, or am I going to adapt and act like country B? But how can I forget about country A? But how can I start acting like country B when I wasn't even born or raised here, right? So that's the crisis, more or less, that people have. So it could be that the person is there as an individual with their own past collective ideas, right? And that person is alone. So you would have to dig deeper into what that person's ideals are. Now, ideals, I don't think anybody has a unique perspective or a unique take on life. I think everybody is either copies of a culture or of a mindset or of an ideology, or a mixture of mindsets and ideologies, right? That's kind of the good thing. You can always, if a person is very weird or very strange in one context, it's because that ideology could be from a different context, right? Nonetheless, it is from a context. They got their ideology either from reading books, right? From learning about some authors, from the experiences in the other places they were at. But you can always kind of connect the dots and see where the ideology or where the influence comes from, right? So there is no unique individual. Even though that's contrary to popular belief, where people say we are all unique individuals. No, first of all, you're influenced by your culture, by your family, by your friends, by the things you read, by the things you learn, by the decisions that you choose to take in life and how you choose to act, right? You're not unique. So it's not like you're just sitting there meditating and you're developing your own theory. You're a mixture of many things, and sometimes you're just manifesting one ideology or one culture. Okay, but back to looking at identity, looking to identify with a person by using common ground, which, like I mentioned, this goes back to step 2 in establishing that rapport. But here it is different because we're going to be looking at Erikson's theory, developmental theory. Now, there are a couple developmental psychological theories out there. There's, for example, Sigmund Freud's theory that only, I think, it gets up to puberty. There's Piaget's. There are a couple out there, but Erikson's very interesting. If you really have a chance, look at it, because his theory doesn't just consider, and this is sometimes what I hate about psychologists and theorists, they focus highly on children and teenagers. And sometimes they don't even focus on teenagers, they just focus on kids. Education, when you talk to a teacher or someone talking about education, they just focus on kids. They don't ever talk about adults, college students, or technical schools, or even like older adult schools, right? And Erikson's theory allows room for all of that, right? From the moment you're born up until, like, when you're 80, 90 and you die. So, and we are all still growing. I mean, even if you're 30, 40, 50, 60, I don't care what age you are, you're still growing, you're still learning new things, right? You're not dead. So the heart of Erikson's theory is the struggle that we have when we're teenagers, right? And it's very interesting. I think it's his greatest contribution to the psychological field and studies. And it basically says that when you're a teenager, more or less, in your teens, from when you're 13 to all the way to 19, around that area, give and take, around that age gap, you are looking to identify yourself with groups, with people, with friends, with peers, right? You're trying to establish who you are. And I think that's very important, because a lot of people can go back to early childhood and say, okay, you were traumatic, or you were traumatized when you were a child or when you were a young adult. But, like, I think those teenage years are key. However you are when you're a teenager, that's pretty much how you're going to be for the rest of your life, right? The way you think, the way you act, the way you perceive the world, the way you react to the world, your beliefs, right? Now, Erikson says that when you're a teenager, you have this identity crisis, right? Which is, the identity crisis can be defined as lack of identity or confusion for your identity, right? So you can either be missing an identity, right? Like, I don't know who I am because there is nothing I identify with, or I have maybe 2-3 different things that I could identify with, and I don't know which of those things I am, right? So it's either confusing or lacking, right? And this happens when you're a teenager. So I think a very key thing that we could ask people potentially is, how were you as a teenager, right? How were your teenage years? Did you have friends? Did you go out? Were you were you like a bookworm? How was your social life as a teenager? How was the relationship with your parents as a teenager? What happened when you were a teenager, right? I think the teenage years are key. Now, this is where I'm gonna start mixing things. So why is having an identity important? Well, it gives you an objective. It gives you somewhere to point at, right? Somewhere to point, so you could shoot at that. So if you have an identity, you belong to a group, to a culture, to your friends, to an ideology. It gives you a goal, right? And I think, going back to, like, Jordan Peterson and many theorists have said that having a goal is one of the most important things, right? So you need to have an objective. You need to have meaning in your life. You need to know where you're going. Like with Viktor Frankl, you need to have meaning, right? You need to have an end goal in mind. And this is where one of Nietzsche's famous phrases, which I think I don't really think about Nietzsche when I think of this phrase, but I think he's the one that said it. It's something like, if you have a why, you can suffer through any how, which basically means if you have a reason to do something, the process or the means to get there, however difficult those processes are, if the reason you're doing it is strong enough, right? You identify with the reason, you will be able to go through that hardship, right? So it's basically, if you have an objective, right? If you have an identity, you can suffer through any process. You can withstand it, right? And this is where we have that idea of, like, people need to believe in something, right? People sometimes tend not to identify, when they are in different contexts. So it is hard to stay identified or have a sense when the context doesn't help, right? And that's kind of like where people later on in life can also enter an identity crisis, right? Where they're confused or they're lacking that identity, that end goal, right? So they don't have the means. The means in this case is just basically having that objective, having that identity. So anything you face in life, however challenging it is, it could be it could be like not even that challenging, but you're still going to suffer through it because you don't really have an objective, an end goal, right? And this happens, of course, when we're in different contexts, when even just something as simple as moving from one place to another, or having a different job will put you in different contexts, right? Losing or gaining friends, those different changes, right? If you don't have that end goal, if you don't have that identity, right, it's going to change that. So this is very important to know in people, right? Because then we have the representation, right? The symbolism. Representation is also very important. I just recently came across it through the book of The Mystery of the Capital. And it talks about how basically a society cannot work without symbols, without representing your identity, like the flag, money, time, right? It's very interesting because in this book by Hernando de Soto, he talks about how, for example, money doesn't really exist. Time doesn't really exist. But when we see representation, symbolisms of it, like for example, cash, money with the government seal, or we see a clock, then we're able to believe in that idea, right? So, excuse me, this is the power of representation, right? And my question would be, like, how much of representing does come in here? Like, you could be this type of person, but if you're not really letting that out, if you're not really manifesting that, right? If you're not representing, you may not really feel identified with that. You may even feel like a phony, right? And if that's not important for you, then eventually you'll let go of it. But if that is important for you, you want to hang on to that, then you do have to express and manifest that state once in a while, right? Now, I'm going to get a little bit into this part. Well, what if you say, this person that I'm interacting with just simply doesn't want to connect with me, right? They don't want me to connect with them. They know that when you connect with someone, either on a conscious or unconscious level, they know that when you connect with me, or they know that when you connect with them, you'll be in a condition or in a situation to transform, right, one and the other, right? And maybe they'll say, I don't want that, right? So I'm not going to let you in. I'm putting up walls. I'm not letting you in. I'm not going to tell you how my teenager years were. I'm not really letting you into my psyche. I don't care. And when that happens, I mean, that's totally fine and that's fair, but you really can't do much about it, right? And that's going to tie into the next step that I'm going to make in the next video, which is basically distancing yourself, right? Like, you already did your part, and if they don't want to listen, or they don't want to interact with you or transform each other, like the Carl Jung quote from last video, then that's fine, right? You can't do anything about it then. But you could do this attempt of trying to let the other person find or discover their own meaning, right? And there's just a very strong idea, which is actually in the summary by Viktor Frankl, and from his book Man in Search of Meaning, where he says, okay, this person comes at me like very depressed, and he was a psychotherapist, and he says, the person says, I'm very sad, I want to commit suicide, I want to kill myself. And then he asks, like, what's stopping you, right? And then the person starts like listing off reasons why the person doesn't do it, and he says, okay, that's what gives meaning to your life, right? Those are your anchors. So that's a very, like, in very, how can I say it, in very dire circumstances, in very extreme circumstances, that's like the ultimate thing that you can do to detect a person's meaning, end goals, objectives, even identity, right? Because If the person says, oh, I don't do it because of my family, then you know that they view themselves, they identify themselves as a family person, right? Okay, so Chris Voss also said something interesting where he says, when you're communicating with a person, and this goes back to the step of communication to try to extract that identity, staying silent is not listening. And that's something very interesting because we could make the mistake of thinking that when we are listening, we have to stay silent, right? Like, okay, I'm gonna listen to you. I'm just gonna stay silent. But then it's kind of like the bubble, the mind bubble that pops out, and you're thinking about other things, right? Or you're not thinking about anything. You're not really listening. So listening requires you to be thinking, to be understanding, to be even interrupting the person, to be engaged in what they're saying, right? You need to ask questions, interact, and dig in deeper. That's true listening. It's not just staying quiet. Now, when you identify with a person, there is a faux pas. A faux pas is like a social mistake or a blunder or something that people can view as, oh, that's embarrassing. You shouldn't have done that. And the faux pas is one-upping. Now, one-upping, when you're trying to identify with a person, right, and find common ground, the person's going to talk to you about their interests, what they like, and so are you, right? So if a person shares this, you're going to share something similar to try to find that connection. Now, we could fall into the trap of the faux pas, right? Or into this mistake of, I went to Germany. Oh, well, I went to France, so you're trying to establish that connection, but you could just come off as pretentious, right? As arrogant, like, oh, well, since you did this, I did this, and I did it better, right? But I think here, it's not to create a faux pas as such, when you need to create that sense of team spirit or a sense of fellowship, right? So I think that's more important. You need to focus on, maybe it's even like how you say it or when you say it. Like if a person is sharing something with you and you say, oh, I can identify with this, maybe just don't say it right away, because that would be one-upping. But if you wait until later to say it, then it will not only show that you have been listening, but it will show that you're trying to connect, right, under not so hostile circumstances as in saying it in that moment. So yeah, you can do this when you need to establish that sense of team spirit, that sense of fellowship, right? Find ways to connect, but try not to fall into these foul pas, right? Now, a new lesson that we could take from this would be justifying your actions to a greater cause. So that goes back to the means and the ends, right? If you identify with something like a soldier, right, will identify with their nation, with bravery, with being a hero, with protecting and defending their home and liberty and freedom, right? So the process of having to kill someone will be justified, right? It's like, do the ends justify the means? No, they don't. That's an ethical dilemma, but it shouldn't even be an ethical dilemma, because if it weren't for the means, if it wasn't for the end, the means would not be justified in themselves. And the means aren't justified just because the end goal helps it, right? It's still a mistake, but it's a complex mistake now, because you have good results, or you have a good outcome, or a potential good outcome, right? But no, the means never justify the ends. But you tell yourself that, right? You identify with that, and that helps you cope with, for example, having to do bad things like killing a person, right? And that's okay. Now, this happened, for example, during the Cold War era with communism, or for example with the idea of weapons of mass destruction with Iraq in the early 2000s, right? Now, if you don't really want to be a part of the bad things that lead to the objective, right? Like the bad things as a means, you could identify deeply with the person, but at the same time stay distant, right? Now, in the next video, we're going to get into a couple of the more practical things. I think from now on, we've been seeing a lot of theory with these videos. Excuse me, but my objective is now that we move towards more practical things. So step 7 and step 8, and I think from now on we're going to be focusing on the practical side of things. But yeah, just to kind of like summarize this, we are talking about establishing common ground by identifying with the other person's identity, right? So detecting that, and also their whys, why they do what they do, what do they believe in, right? And Yeah, sometimes you may need distance, and that's what we're going to talk about in step 8, right? So be on the lookout for that video. Next video is called It's a Power Thing, and that's where we really get into the practical notion of things. So be on the lookout for that video. And that's all I got for this one. So I'll see you in the next one. Peace.